All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Erin Daly, and I'm the director of the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment, a gathering of scholars, activists, advocates, judges, and others who are dedicated to working at the intersection of human rights and environmental protection. If you're not already familiar with us, I invite you to spend some time on the website at GNHRE.org, where you'll find a growing research repository, community member pages containing announcements, blogs, and other items of interest to our members, a video library of some of our recent events, including last year's global series on human rights strategies and climate change litigation, and many other items. And if you're not already a member, I would invite you to join through the website. I'm especially thrilled today to welcome you to the first summer-winter school jointly sponsored by the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment and UN Environment UNEP, and organized by Dina Lupin-Townsend, Deputy Director of the GNHRE, and Angela Kariuki, also a member of the GNHRE core team. We hope you'll sign up for many of the extraordinary courses being offered over the course of the next few days. It is really a stellar lineup of some of the world's leading experts sharing their experiences and insights on a variety of cutting-edge topics at the intersection of human and environmental rights. Today, I'm very happy to welcome you to Environmental Crime, Waste, and Human Rights, where we'll learn about environmental crime and its relationship to the right to life and health, with a particular focus on vulnerable communities, including children and Indigenous people. With us to walk through these important and complex issues are Dr. Aphrodite Smagati and Dr. Amanda Cabrejo-Leroux. Let me just introduce them. Dr. Aphrodite Smagati is legal officer with the United Nations Environment Program, where she coordinates the Law Division's activities on implementation and enforcement of environmental law, including under the Green Customs Initiative. Prior to joining UNEP, she worked for the secretariats of the Aarhus and Espoo Conventions and the World Bank. Ms. Smagati is specialized and has published in international environmental law. She holds a PhD in law from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and an LLM from the University of Freiburg in Germany. Dr. Amanda Cabrejo-Leroux is an international legal professional offering consulting, advisory services, and training in environmental law, criminal justice, and human rights. She is passionate about emerging areas of international law and using research as a catalyst for action. Over the past few years, Amanda was an associate legal officer in the law division of UNEP at its headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya. In this role, she contributed to the development of environmental law and governance at the international, regional, and national levels. She was the law division thematic focal point on environmental crimes, advising on new strategies, policies, and partnerships worldwide. Before joining UNEP, Amanda was a visiting academic at the Center of Criminology at the University of Cape Town and a legal consultant. She's the lead author of a report entitled Tightening the Net Toward a Global Legal Framework on Transnational Organized Environmental Crime, published in 2015 by WWF and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Amanda holds a PhD in law from the Sorbonne Law School, and she is the recipient of the Vendôme Prize awarded by the French Ministry of Justice for her PhD thesis about the prohibition of double jeopardy at the crossroads. She holds also a master's degree in Spanish law, French law, and comparative criminal law, and an LLM in international criminal law. Amanda, we'll begin with you to tell us about the concept of environmental crime and the nexus with human rights. Aphrodite will then follow up with a brief overview of the related SDGs, the international and national response to environmental crime, and UNEP's role. We will make sure to have time for questions at the end, so please write any questions or comments in the chat. And we are recording this, so please turn off your cameras if you would not like to be seen. With that, let's begin the program. Amanda?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and well, thank you for monitoring this session so early on your side. That's a big commitment for the summer-winter course. And thank you to the organizers, and especially Dina and Angela from UNEP for organizing this very interesting week and inviting me to take part in this session. So thank you very much. And hi to all the participants. We're going to try to make you please intervene in this session. We'll have a few questions on Mentimeters, and please add your question in the chat at the bottom. So let's start with the following. I hope you can all see my screen. So we're going to talk about environmental crime, waste and human rights today. And the session is divided in 3 parts. First, I'll be talking about environmental crime and its very complex impact on human rights. Then Aphrodite will be talking about international and national responses and the role of UNEP. And finally, we'll quickly go back to me for a part on law enforcement approach, how to look at environmental crime with a lens of criminal law, and how it can also have actually an adverse impact on human rights. So first part, so environmental crime and its impact on human rights. So here, first question on Mentimeter. So I don't know if you've used Mentimeter before, but basically I'm going to switch to this slide. So you see at the top, you basically have to use your cell phone or go online, enter menti.com, and then you submit this code on the top, which is 3105833. And then you can submit your answer to this question. So basically, when you hear environmental crime, what comes to mind? So please enter menti.com with a code and you can participate. Let's see if we have a few answers.
Could you please provide the code again?
Oh, you don't see it on the slide? So it's 3105833. So let's see. Yeah, ecocide. Okay. I think you can submit a few. It's coming. Indigenous rights, smuggling, wild animals, rhinos, toxic waste, deforestation, COVID, okay, conflicts, yes, poverty, poaching, pollution, a big one. Great, it's taking shape. Toxic waste. So we're already seeing it's going in many directions, which perfect because we are touching on many issues with the concept of environmental crime. So I see even single-use plastic, degradation of ecosystem, question of conflicts are coming in.
We can't seem to see the slide, Amanda. Can you share it?
That is okay. Let me try to show that slide. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes. Thank you.
Great. So we have 28 answers. That's great. Thank you to all the participants. Fishing was also mentioned. Very good. I think we're touching many aspects. Justice. So ecocide comes as a big one. That's interesting because I can explain quickly what is the concept of ecocide and how it's a bit different when we talk about environmental crime. Fundamental rights are coming in, good, because it's it's a theme for today, so it's also in the picture. So yeah, and poaching coming as a big one, poaching and pollution. So yeah, there's definitely aspects of poaching and illegal trade with natural resources, timber and illegal deforestation, and also illegal fishing. And on the other side, we have pollution type of behavior and crime. And there's mention of toxic dumping, toxic waste. So we're going to look a bit at all of that. Let me go back to sharing my slides. Thank you so much to all the participants for your answers there. So yeah, many things come to mind. And then the first thing to have in mind also when we talk about environmental crime is that there's no universally agreed legal definition. So we don't have one treaty that would give us a definition. So that also makes things a bit more complex. And we have what I call a working definition with the report by Interpol and UNEP from 2016, and again in 2018 with a second report from UNEP. So basically a very broad umbrella term, a collective term to describe illegal activities harming the environment and aiming at benefiting individuals or groups or companies from the exploitation, damage, trade, theft of natural resources, including serious crime and transnational organized crime. So it's pretty broad, and basically you can look at many types of environmental crimes. So they were very much all in this Mentimeter map, so that's great. So wildlife crimes, so all the poaching, forestry crimes, so the broader exploitation of forest resources, then illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, illegal mining. Maybe it was not in the submissions before. Illegal mining is also important, and everything around waste and chemicals, illegal dumping, disposal, and trade of waste and chemicals. Also, illegal trade in ODS, ozone depleting substances, and broader pollution crimes. So in that image, you can see all those crimes represented in the middle, and they're connected to broader crimes there. So money laundering, organized crime, tax fraud, all of that, making a very big picture. And also meaning in terms of intervention, you have quite a few international organizations, quite a few different expertise that are needed to target environmental crimes. Here, just a map to give you an idea of the very broad global nature of environmental crime. So if we look at rhino poaching, so most of the rhinos, like 85% of the population is in South Africa and a few other range countries. And then you see it's very much a form of tracking way beyond Africa and mostly toward Asia, toward Vietnam and China. But there are also trafficking routes that can go through the US, that can go through Europe. So that means it's also a very complex phenomenon to target. And here another map, if we look at Mercury and how it's being used by artisanal and small-scale gold mining, this is very much a widespread issue. So related to also illegal mining, and then there's an illegal trade of chemicals and mercury happening that can be damaging in many ways to the environment and people. So that is very widespread, with Southeast Asia being very important, but you also have a lot of countries in Africa and Latin America. And also, what's complex about environmental crime is that it's constantly evolving, evolving trends, which make it difficult for law enforcement, evolving trends in modus operandi, for instance, with a huge shift toward digital cell and using platforms not even so much a dark web, but using very common social media, such as Facebook, to sell protected species, for instance. And also the trend in routes are evolving with transit hubs that then change when maybe the law response is improved and enforcement is improved and new routes appear. And also the markets, those illegal markets are evolving with a very quick example here, emerging markets coming from South Africa in succulents, so protected. It's also to remind you when we talk about poaching and when we talk about protected species, it's not only fauna, it's not only big animals, but it's also tiny plants that need protection and that are targeted by traffic. So yeah, an example of a very new trend that's appeared in the past 2 years around succulents coming from South Africa, and very challenging to fight against this trend. There's many tools online if you want to look more at trends in environmental crime, and I'm just mentioning this one by the Environmental Investigation Agency because they released it last week. So it's very new. It's looking at wildlife crime, so not so much about trafficking in waste and chemicals, but very interesting tool to see different maps, compare different products, and see what's happening. Then to see the full scale of the phenomenon, we have to talk about the monetary value of it, which is quite tricky because, of course, being illegal trafficking, illegal markets, it's very difficult to do a proper evaluation of the scale. So there are different figures out there. Basically, the takeaway is that environmental crime represent one of the 4 largest criminal areas in the world with drug, counterfeit, and human trafficking. So it's really a serious issue, even if you're interested only by the monetary value. And of course, we go much beyond that because we're interested in the impact on biodiversity that go much beyond the value, monetary value, and impact on communities and human rights. But that just gives you a sense of the issue we're talking about. And here, the scale, you can see illegal logging and trade is actually very much the biggest illegal market when we talk about environmental crime. So yeah, just give you a sense of the scale of the issue. Yeah, talking now about impact, I'm going to question on Mentimeter. Sorry. So how do I share it? 1 second, and go back to Mentimeter. Okay, I think you show it now. And then go back to my second question. Yes. So yeah, now that you heard a bit about environmental crime and different types, so what do you think what are the human rights affected by environmental crime? So if you can go again to menti.com and use the code 3105833. So the right to livelihood, health, life, women health, women right, health environment, yes, food, self-determination, water, clean environment, yeah, food security is a big one. Clean air is pollution issue. Yeah, so culture, I like that. Future generation rights, good one. And the question around ownership of the land also coming up. And health at the center, health and healthy environments, very much there and connected. Great, so again, we get to see a very broad scope. Trying to think if there's a few missing ones. Yeah, maybe I'll show you the presentation. So we have 24 participants on this one, 25. Beautiful map. So I'm going to go back to the presentation again. Great, so yeah, many human rights can be affected, and I'm going to talk about 3 areas of impact. So environmental crimes have an impact on biodiversity and climate first, and that's how they can also relate to human rights. So they contribute to degradation of ecosystems and loss of habitat with all deforestation, for instance, and the collapse of biodiversity, of course, when species are pushed to the brink of extinction. And they also contribute to climate change with all the illegal logging, and also ozone depleting substances can have also an effect, a contributing factor to climate warming. And this is interesting because this is starting to be an entry point for emerging case law linking illegal logging, so deforestation, to the duty of the state to fight deforestation and to comply with the goals in terms of climate goals, and therefore creating the link to this broad trend in case law we're seeing around climate change and the right to a healthy environment. So this is something emerging, especially maybe in a few cases in Brazil. And here we have an entry point to really connect in terms of legal terms what we're talking about when we're talking about environmental crime and human rights. Then another aspect that was also mentioned in the Mentimeter responses, the impact on sustainable development, and I will add sustainable development and stability. So indeed, when natural resources are being trafficked, that leave few possibilities to create more sustainable businesses around the use of natural resources, and that create an impact for local communities to the point of creating issues of food security. If we think, for instance, of fishing communities who are fishing stocks, and those stocks are being destroyed by overfishing. So that's typically one issue, and also broader impact if those form of trade are not part of the legal trade. That also means a loss of taxes and a loss of services for citizens. And in some countries, it's very much linked to factors contributing to instability and conflict. So that was also something some of the participants you did mention in the Mentimeter. So it's in that sense a very broad impact, and here we can see a broad range of human rights that can be jeopardized by environmental crime. And the third level would be the impact on human health, and health was big in the Mentimeter. So here I will distinguish when we talk about activities around waste and illegal chemical. chemicals, and Aphrodite will be talking more about that in just a few minutes. And then just a word about wildlife crime and illegal logging. We're not so much approached with that lens on human health, but of course it's something that changed dramatically with the COVID-19 pandemic and all the new discussions around zoonotic diseases and how wildlife trafficking can be a factor. And also deforestation is a factor because it's mostly the loss of habitat that can create situations where wild species enter in contact with humans. So there is discussion around that and ideas coming from civil society around the need of a new text to better address this nexus with human health. And for now, there's one response for the UN is to talk about One Health approach, that we really have to have an holistic approach looking at human health, animal health, and the health of the environment. And another form of impact on human rights, it's very much a direct human cost of environmental crime. So first, if we talk about wildlife crime, we can talk about the rangers being killed while protecting wildlife. So very direct impact on human beings. And also more largely, if we talk about environmental defenders, and it's of course one of the themes for the week, environmental defenders were persecuted or even killed for their role in protecting the environment. They're often fighting against environmental crimes, either pollution or either wildlife crimes. So in that sense, a very direct human cost of all those crimes. Thank you. And now I will just, before we go to part 3, I will let Aphrodite talk us through international and national responses, and especially the role of UNEP. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Amanda. I tried to share my, can you confirm that you can all see my presentation? Can somebody confirm? Okay, good. Okay, so thanks so much. Thanks, Erin, Dina, and Angela for this course, and I hope that we provide some food for thought today on this issue of environmental crime and human rights. Let me start my presentation.
Can you share your screen so that it's full screen?
Yes, I will do this now in the... Yes, can you see it now? Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks so much. So Amanda explained to you everything about the anatomy of environmental crime. And now we are going to focus on international and national response and what is the role of UNEP. We are going to zoom in a little bit more on chemicals and waste, which is also part of this webinar. But before that, I would like to go a little bit back to the impact on sustainable development, because this is a very important topic now in the decade that we are going through until 2030. And I would like to briefly refer to what Amanda also mentioned. Okay, I mean, environment and human health, it's obvious that illegal trade in wildlife, for instance, causes imbalances to biodiversity and the ecosystems, or the illegal trade and dumping of hazardous waste can critically affect the environment and the health of nearby communities and also indigenous communities. Then the economic dimension of the impact of the environmental crime cannot be overlooked. In monetary terms, we saw that the worth annually is estimated up to 259 billion United States dollars annually, although these figures can play. But this includes the illegal revenue derived from environmental crime, the loss for legal commerce, and the loss of tax revenue. Then social dimension, of course, and poverty because the problem is that many organized networks, criminal networks relating to environmental crime, they turn to low-income and marginalized communities, and with the expectation that these communities will collaborate for easy money. So this really impedes also the right for development of these peoples, and undermines their work as legitimate workers. And finally, very important aspect, the political aspect, because the environmental, economic, and social distress created by environmental crime may flow into business and politics and may affect the stability of a nation to the extent that it poses a threat for peace and security. And this is particularly the case in developing states. For instance, in Africa, organized crime has often been observed to be intertwined with terrorism and politics, even at highest ranking levels of government. And now these are our beautiful 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Probably just to mention some relating to environmental crime. 1, no poverty. The Sustainable Development Goal 3 on good health and well-being. 6 on clean water and sanitation, or 14 and 15, life below water and life on land. Life below water, especially when it comes to fishing. And all these also relate to different human rights as stipulated under the Universal Declaration, the 2 covenants, or the different conventions, such as the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to life, health, the special protection for mothers and children, right of the people to dispose of their natural wealth and resources, just to mention some. I would like to share with you now, to watch a video with you. This is about how mercury, which is one of the most toxic pollutants, and since 2016 regulated by the Minamata Convention, how it affects women in particular because of the biological, sociocultural, and economic reasons. So if you confirm that you can hear the audio, please. Sorry, is the audio okay? Can you?
No, we're not hearing the audio.
No. Should I try again? Or Angela, would you like to share it? Let me try again. Optimize. Okay. Share audio. Okay, I'm trying again. Please let me know.
Okay, that works.
Okay, good.
Mercury is one of the most toxic pollutants in the world. It is a health, economic, and environmental problem that affects all of us, but not all in the same way. Women are more negatively impacted due to the biological, socio-cultural, and economic factors. Mercury exposure through everyday products such as fish is especially dangerous to pregnant women and their children, since it is transmitted through the placenta. Women, the main target of the cosmetics industry, are the most affected by the harmful toxicity of mercury-containing products like skin lightening creams, and more than 4 million women work in artisanal and small-scale gold mining. Underpaid and undervalued miners who are pushed to deal with the dangers of mercury amalgamation. The Minamata Convention was created to protect human health and the environment from this harmful pollutant, with a unique focus on protecting vulnerable populations from mercury exposure, especially women, children, and through them, future generations.
The Convention tackles toxic mercury through its entire life cycle, where gender issues are important every step of the way. This includes supporting gender-specific trainings and helping implement national action plans with gender perspective. with special focus on the problem of women and child labor in artisanal and small-scale gold mining.
Together, we are making gender inequality and Mercury
history.
Okay, so because of this nexus between chemicals, waste, environmental concerns, and human rights, there are also two special procedures that have been instituted under the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. So the first one is the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. You can see the full title of this mandate on your screens. That was established by the Human Rights Commission already in 1995 in recognition of the exposure of people to hazardous substances and how human rights are directly relevant. So this special rapporteur has developed several instruments and guidance through the years. And currently the special rapporteur is Marcos Orellana from Chile. The second special procedure as an independent human rights expert is the special rapporteur on the issue of human rights and the environment. This is a relatively recent special procedure. It was established in 2012, and the current special rapporteur is David Boyd from Canada. So what is their response and the role of UNEP? So UNEP has a mandate to protect the environment, and actually environmental crime has become more and more topical in what we are doing. But let's look a little bit at the two types of response. First, legislative response, and then implementation and enforcement. On the legislative response, we again have two levels of response to environmental crime, international and national. First, on the international level, we have several global or regional multilateral environmental agreements. Most of these agreements have been negotiated under the United Nations, and these agreements regulate usually the legal and illegal trade of environmentally sensitive commodities. This can be biodiversity, such as living modified organisms, chemicals and waste, ozone and other substances that can cause climate change, or marine pollution. The MEAs under marine pollution are administered by the International Maritime Organization. Now, on illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, there is no international binding legal instrument. There are soft instruments such as guidelines that are administered by the Food and Agriculture Organization. So unfortunately, there is no international legally binding or soft instruments on illegal logging and trade in timber. There's a lot going on at the national level, and also the EU has adopted several instruments as one of the main economic integration organizations. Last but not least, two instruments that are very important for the for environmental crime, and they are under the auspices of UNODC, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the United Nations Convention Against Transboundary Organized Crime. Because as we saw in the first part of the presentation, environmental crime is rarely an incident, it's usually part of an organized crime, and there is a strong transboundary element. Before we look at the national response, at the international level, I would like to zoom in a little bit at the chemicals and waste, but I don't want to give you the response. I wanted to do a Menti on that. If you can go on Menti.com. Can you see my screen? Can you see the Menti screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So can you please write which multilateral environmental agreements you know that in your view relate to environmental crime? So what comes in your mind? And so you can go to Menti.com and use the code 5733-7425. Okay, that's good. I see some responses coming. Only 2. Okay, Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm. Marpol under IMO, correct. And London Convention, CITES on biodiversity, correct. Yes, CBD, especially as regards the LMOs, living modified organisms, which is another term to define the genetically modified organisms. Ramsar, CITES, that's yeah, UNFCCC, Minamata, very well, London Convention. Okay, CITES seems to be one of the most popular ones. Montreal Protocol, very good. Ramsar, Paris Agreement, yes. And also one that I will stop this now with the results. Another one that is also very important and it's not very popular is one administered by UNESCO on the World Heritage. So let's look a little bit more to the MEAs on chemicals and waste. These are the 4 major multilateral environmental agreements that regulate waste at the global level: the Basel Convention, Rotterdam Convention, Stockholm Convention, and the most recent one, the Minamata Convention on Mercury. There are several also at the regional level, such as the Protocol on Pollutant Release and Transfer Registers, PRTRs, which is a protocol under the Aarhus Convention, or the Convention on the Ban of the Import into Africa and the Control of Transboundary Movements of waste within Africa, the Bamako Convention, as it is known. Let's look a little bit at the objectives of these chemicals, of these conventions. If you look at the Articles 1 of the Stockholm, Rotterdam, and Minamata Convention, as well as the preamble of the Basel Convention, they don't mention the environment only, but they also refer to human health. So how do all these hazardous waste and chemicals affect human health? So now we looked at the international legislative response. What is the national legislative response? Whether an act or omission incurs criminal liability, as opposed to or in addition to administrative and or civil liability, of course, depends on the jurisdiction. So in some jurisdictions, we see that they do not attribute criminal liability for this type of actions, acts or omissions. When they decide to criminalize, let's say, we have noticed that there are 3 main approaches. The first is that some countries opt to include penal sanctions in their environmental legislation. Other countries decide to include environmental offenses in their penal codes. And finally, we also noticed that there is a mixed approach, such as in Brazil. So that was about the legislative response. Now we're going to look at the implementation and enforcement. And actually on the legislative response, I should say that UNEP, as the main international agency dealing with the environment worldwide, had a catalytic role, especially during the first decades of its existence, in the establishment of this, in the negotiations of the major multilateral environmental agreements, but also in providing country assistance in environmental law, including on concerns of environmental crime. Then on implementation and enforcement. This is a very, very important element, because even if we have the perfect laws, we know that unless they are implemented effectively and enforced, these laws are futile. And actually, I would like to refer to the first global report on environmental rule of law, which found that weak enforcement is a global trend that is exacerbating environmental threats, despite prolific growth in environmental laws and agencies worldwide over the last 4 decades. So from this alone, we know that there is a lot of legislation in place, but we need to work more on effective implementation and enforcement efforts. And actually, UNEP, since the beginning of the 21st century, while we continued working on emerging issues of environmental law, we have been actively working with countries and other partners on global, regional, and country initiatives to support implementation and enforcement. And we do that in 3 main areas. First, training and capacity building for enforcement agents. For instance, just recently, last year, we provided training for police officers in Ethiopia, specifically on environmental crime. Or just now, again, we provided training for the judiciary and prosecution in Zambia, again, on environmental crime. Then special environmental courts, we support this type of efforts, and some countries actually have decided to ensure that the judiciary and prosecution receive specialized training. And in this case, what we notice is that when we have special environmental courts, environmental crime is a different priority, because otherwise in the common courts, sometimes environmental crime is not at the top of the list for a prosecutor or the police. Finally, international cooperation. This is also a very important element because through this promotion of networks between different professionals and agencies at the national and international level, we allow the exchange of information and lessons learned on environmental crime. Here I would like to advertise some of our reports that relate to environmental crime. We produce a lot of studies and reports that we think they provide useful insights on environmental crime, and they highlight challenges in implementation and enforcement. And they also provide options and clarifications to countries that wish to legislate on environmental crime or to enhance implementation and enforcement of their existing legislation. So the first one, you see the state of knowledge of crimes that have serious impacts of the environment. That was one of our landmark publications, and Amanda referred to this publication earlier, which was an expert process. Then the illegal trade in chemicals. This is a 2020 report, and I also must recognize here that Amanda worked on this report while she was a colleague here at the division. So this report also recognizes that there is a range of guidelines nowadays that govern the trade in chemicals, but many of these chemicals remain unregulated, or even if they're regulated, there are significant enforcement and implementation issues. Then the model law and guidance for regulating lead paint. There is UNEP is part of a partnership of the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead in Paint, together with the World Health Organization and the US Environment Protection Agency. So we created this model law and guidance where criminal liability also comes into the picture as an option for legislators. And finally, a very recent report, 2021, neglected on environmental justice impacts on plastic pollution. My colleague Angela actually has intensively worked on this. As we know, marine litter and microplastics is an issue that has come at the top of the international agenda. There is more and more concerns about marine litter and microplastics. But how does this type of pollution affect vulnerable communities? Actually, speaking of marine litter and microplastics, just also to mention that there were amendments under the Basel Convention that have sought to put within the scope of the convention plastics that qualify as hazardous waste under the convention. These amendments enter into force now in 2021, last January. And at UNEP, we do also a lot of work on marine litter and microplastics. Specifically, now we implement several activities where we provide targeted technical assistance and support to countries that wish to legislate on marine litter and microplastics. And let me show another video. Can you also please confirm that you can hear the sound? This is about the marine litter and our right for a healthy environment.
Every year, pollution kills millions of people.
Can somebody indicate? Can you listen
Yes,
to the...
we can hear it.
Okay.
Around the world. That's because we breathe in toxic air. We eat fish laden with mercury, and we drink from rivers clogged with plastics. These issues are so common, we've begun to accept them. But did you know that you have a right to a clean environment? Every day, people can use the law and their purchasing power to press governments and businesses to respect Mother Nature. Marine. Billions of people around the world rely on our oceans for food and for their livelihoods. But 8 million tons of plastic and toxic waste enter the sea each year, contaminating fish, clogging shorelines, and hampering shipping. By exercising your fundamental human rights, you can help prevent marine pollution. You can demand that businesses live up to their responsibility to curtail marine pollution. You can boycott companies that waste resources and use too much packaging. You can call on governments to enact policies that reduce the use of plastic. And you can change your own habits as a consumer, using less and recycling more. The protection of our seas and oceans is our human right. Pollution affects almost every aspect of life on Earth. But when people exercise their environmental rights, we have a fighting chance to beat pollution and to ensure the health of our planet. Do your part. Claim your right to a safe and healthy life. It is our human right.
All right, and then Green Customs Initiative, a few words about this initiative that has been there for almost 16 years now. UNEP Law Division runs the secretariat of this partnership of international entities, mainly MEA secretariats, UNODC and other organizations. You can see who are our partners, several MEAs, UNODC, of course, and then to add the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical, for the prohibition of chemical weapons, the World Customs Organization, and Interpol. So we cooperate to prevent the illegal trade in environmentally sensitive commodities and substances and to facilitate their legal trade. And we do that by targeting customs and other relevant border control officers. I would invite you all to check our website, www.greencustoms.org. And now, very briefly, two major projects on chemicals and waste that we implemented and what their impact was. The first was the Regional Enforcement Network for Chemicals and Waste that ran for 7 years in Asia and the Pacific. And there was a twofold approach of intervention. The first was to build the capacity of enforcement officers, especially at the front line, such as customs officers. And the second element was to establish communication and coordination among national and regional agencies. Actually, it was estimated that during the project implementation, over 865,000 tons of hazardous chemicals and harmful waste were recorded. And another project is the Waste Force project, more recent, Same approach, training for enforcement officers and other enforcement agents, and secondly, networking and promotion of the cooperative approach, both at a national and international level. You see a list of implementing partners on your screen. UNEP worked on package 4 on capacity building activities for European and Asia Pacific authorities. And one of the key products was exactly guidance for prosecutors. And there were also several networking events organized within this project. Now, 2 upcoming projects that we are going to have together with UNODC, and they were both inspired from the recent COVID-19 pandemic. The first one is SAFE. So it aims to contribute to the prevention of wildlife-related pandemics. And part of what we are going to do as UNEP, we are going to provide regulatory and advisory support to governments to manage and phase out high-risk facilities and locations. And the second project relates to waste, tackling waste trafficking to support a circular economy on waste. Again, UNEP will work on the transboundary transboundary movement of waste aspect. There will be a lot of focus also on medical and other waste that was generated due to the pandemic. And finally, to close this presentation, I would like to mention our Asia Environmental Enforcement Awards. UNEP, together with other partners, has been organizing these awards for the past 5 years. Now we are in the 2021 edition. The awards recognize and celebrate excellence in enforcement by government officials and institutions combating transboundary environmental crime, such as illegal trade in wildlife, illegal trade in chemicals or waste, and including plastic. The focus is in the Asian region, but there is also one award on Asia-Africa cooperation, especially when it comes to wildlife crime. So I'm going to play the video, and if you don't hear the sound, please interrupt. Thank you.
A huge number of species are now on the brink of extinction.
Protection of the environment is the key to perpetuity of life.
The police will not leave any stone unturned to catch illegal wildlife trader.
By fighting transboundary crime, we can live in the safer and better planet.
As long as there are still tigers, there will be the Perlitan and the Royal Malaysia Police to protect them.
Women has more potential. They can do anything possible.
We want to send a message to the world that Malaysia is not a dumping site of contaminated waste or pollution.
Serving the government, serving our country, and now serving humanity. This is a recognition that I would cherish and treasure all my life.
Yes, you see here all our partners. And that was on my side. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think we can take some questions in the next half hour.
Wait, I have a third party member.
Ah, yes, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Okay, so thank you, Afro, for the view of especially the work of UNEP. And the third part, hopefully, will also respond to, I've seen quite a few very good points in the chat section, especially Victor and Bibiana started the conversation, so that's great, because it's something I wanted to touch on this last section. It's this focus on law enforcement approach and how it has also, unfortunately, an adverse impact on human rights. So in this section, so first, when we think of legal tools needed to fight environmental crime, if you think really basically, what's complex here is that we are at the crossroad between environmental law, trade law, and criminal law. and how you navigate that, and how you, in terms of national legislation, how you make those choices to use sanctions of different level to look at different behavior. It's quite complex indeed, and it's not something, so there's no international framework to make those calls, and it's really up to the legislator in each country to decide how to intervene against what type of behavior. So that's also making things quite complex in terms of transnational activities. But here, so I mentioned a few documents from UNEP and UNODC that are guides to help in the drafting of legislation around those questions. And that include those technical aspects, but also those balancing of interest aspects sometimes. And here very quickly also to tell you that at the international level, there's definitely a trend toward a bigger focus on organized crime. And really the discussion is to say that environmental crimes are not just a green issue, they're a criminal issue, and they have to be treated as such, and they have to be on the agenda of all the law enforcement actors, police, customs, like Aphrodite was explaining, prosecutors and judges, as a criminal issue. And so we have two very recent resolutions going in that direction, one in the context of the COP to the UN Convention on Corruption from December 2019, really making the link between combating corruption as a very important first step to address any type of environmental crime. And the other resolution was adopted in the context of the COP to the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, to also make this link with broader forms of organized crime, and including measures on money laundering and corruption. And there's a third text that's at the stage of a draft resolution at the moment. So it was drafted by the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, and then it's a process where it's then recommended to ECOSOC for adoption by the General Assembly. So potentially we have also a resolution from the General Assembly coming very soon on that topic, very much looking at environmental crimes as a criminal issue, a top priority in fighting organized crime. So this is important because it's clearly a convergence with other type of crime, and we're seeing groups of organized crime that were maybe working on a different type of commodity, let's say drugs, and they do a shift toward environmental crimes for different reasons, for changing conditions. So either complete shifts to one industry to another to dominate a specific product or specific market, or groups that are having flexible operations across multiple commodities and on a very opportunistic basis. And often it's about controlling strategic smuggling routes, and then using those routes to traffic in any type of commodity, environmental commodity or otherwise. And of course, also the issue of convergence between licit and illicit markets. And that's where that can be an issue, especially if you look at illegal fishing and if you look at illegal timber trade. And there we really have to ask a question around corporate liability and how do we manage that space. So here I just mentioned like one very recent report from a Wildlife Justice Commission looking at convergence. That's quite interesting. And then if we look at the criminal law lens, it's very important to make that link, and here it's very useful because in a way you could say that any intervention around environmental crime is doomed to failure if we don't address the much more endemic, widespread issue of corruption. So that's very important, and there are recent reports here from UNODC on corruption in wildlife and corruption in the fishery sector, and also reports are coming up soon. And also to quickly mention the link with money laundering, because this is a common resulting crime of all those environmental crimes. When we have organized crime being involved, it's because they're looking for huge profits, and that's what's the motivation. So of course, targeting the money flow is very important to remove this financial incentive, and to also try to freeze and seize the proceeds of, here I mentioned wildlife crime, but more broadly environmental crime, and is try to use those assets maybe for rehabilitation of the environment. And here I'm going to focus more specifically on wildlife crime and basically address this difficult question of when the fight against wildlife crime backfires and creates adverse impact on human rights. So I'm quickly going to mention three aspects: the issue of over-criminalization, the issue of green militarization, and also public discourses that are disregarding human rights. So three problems we're seeing in this field. So the legal challenge. We're talking about the benefits of using the criminal law lens to address environmental crimes. There is a huge benefit, but there is also a risk. The risk being that if the way the offenses, the criminal offenses are designed, if they're too broad, they're not going to target only organized crime, but they're also going to create an undue burden on indigenous and local communities, depending on wildlife resources. So this is definitely an issue that's at the center of drafting legislation on wildlife crime. And when we think in terms of rights, it's especially to take into account tenure rights of indigenous and local population over wildlife. So things that were mentioned in the chat, to be thinking about traditional hunting and harvesting practices. And a legal tool to address that is when you have legislation, criminal legislation around those issues, is to also have exceptions in the form of permits, certificates, licenses, concessions that allow space, legal space for coexisting practices around traditional use of wildlife. So it's of course a difficult balance that the legislator has to make in each country, depending on the history, depending on the local context, and of course a very important debate where we see this complex nexus between crime and human rights, and the difficulty to find the right balance. But one of the key elements is, of course, with the drafting of those laws, to make sure to include in drafting process the groups that may be impacted negatively, and make sure they're being heard and their tenure rights are being respected. So in that sense, we find the link between ensuring participation rights as a safeguard to preserve the substantial rights of local communities. Then I want to mention green militarization. So this is something that's an issue, especially in quite a few African countries. I'm sitting right now in South Africa, and that's something that's definitely huge in the conservation debate, and for good reasons. So basically, in response to armed and dangerous groups targeting endangered wildlife, there's been this tendency of militarization of conservation. And we also talk about fortress conservation. And that means using quasi-military and security techniques and measures to protect national parks, to protect national privates, but to protect species. And here, of course, the rhino comes to mind, the elephants come to mind, with sometimes very advanced use of drones and military equipment, to protect them against groups that are also very heavily equipped. So we get this landscape with this type of war happening. But the huge problem with this way to approach a problem is that it can result in human rights abuses, and there are accounts coming that are very heartbreaking to hear about organizations or NGOs supporting rangers, but those rangers go too far in terms of using military techniques, and they use that not so much on transnational organized groups, but rather on local population, who should be respected in their rights to a sustainable use of the land and of the wildlife present there. So we get this very conflicted situation that completely backfire, with human rights violation happening and livelihood options being completely threatened for population living around important wildlife, protected wildlife. And that's also backfires in terms of conservation, because that leads to resentment and anger from local population, when they should be recognized as the first defenders of the nature they live in, as the best allies for any conservation intervention. So this is a challenge. This is a challenge we have. And I also want to mention public discourses, because it's also, words can be powerful, and it's very problematic when we hear decision maker or people with responsibilities in the public space making some very troubling statements. So the first one is calls for death penalty for poachers. So I hear that a lot, and it's very problematic. And I try to explain to people, look, human rights are for every humans. You don't choose, that's the first thing. And of course, some countries do apply death penalty, but in a broader human rights approach also means that when we look at criminal sanctions, death penalty should no longer be an option, because it doesn't reach any mean, and it creates another level of suffering and definitely issues with human right to life. So the second one is a call for shoot to kill policies. So those calls saying that basically rangers should kill on the spot the poachers, and that's a great solution. And they actually, every year, a lot of people being killed as suspected poachers. And then, well, you don't have respect of due process, you don't have any trial, so you don't know at the end what happened, if the person was actually poaching or not. And even if that person was poaching, again, this is definitely not a solution to stop a much broader issue. This is not a solution to stop organized groups. And it's definitely not respecting rights of population living close to parks that may try to enter those parks for multiple purposes, for harvesting medicinal plants, for hunting. But yeah, again, the legislation has to create that space also for traditional hunting.
Amanda,
so
I can
yes,
just jump in and ask you to wrap up, because we have so many really interesting questions we want to discuss.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the last example was calls for poisoning a horn, saying, well, this way we kill the users. Again, not a great way to combine a fight against wildlife crime and human rights. So here about a few opening a few ideas of where to go for effective wildlife law enforcement and make sure it's right based. So it has to be tailored to focus on organized crime and make sure the rights of interests of indigenous people and local communities are respected. And also I mentioned due process and the right of the accused. And any lens that's a criminal law lens, law enforcement has to be combined with long-term intervention that's look at alternative livelihoods and very much working in the long term with local communities. And on the other side, looking at demand reduction. This is what is at the end going to make the difference. It's much more difficult to measure. It's much more difficult to design those interventions, but in the long run, that's what matters. So yes, that was my last point. And just to say thank you very much for this challenging question around environmental crime and human rights. Looking at the nexus, it's not something that's being done enough. So I think that was a great idea to include it in your week of debate. And yes, please, we can have a few questions. Thank you very much.
So I just want to thank you on behalf of everybody for this just extraordinary set of presentations where we really got to hear so much about, as you said, sort of the important nexus between environmental crimes and human rights. And you really gave us some insight into new trends, both in terms of the criminal activity, like what you were talking about trade in succulents, things like that, but also new trends in terms of the response at the international, national and local levels, and all these important new initiatives that I think we're all very happy to sort of become aware of. So thank you very, very much. We do have a lot of wonderful questions. And so what I thought I would do is just sort of try to group them so that we can have a discussion about sort of specific issues. And a lot of the questions sort of are around different topics. One sort of just defining the crime and talking about implementation issues. One about remedies, something that you were just talking about right towards the very end, about waste, about climate change, and a few other things that are coming up right now. So let me just start with the first couple of questions. I'm just going to ask you a set of the questions that have come up in the chat and just ask you to talk about sort of defining how we think about just defining the crimes. So one question is, do you know whether environmental crime provisions are more prevalent in certain countries than others? I think those responsible are often large multinational corporations, such as illegal logging for palm oil, for example, and I'm wondering whether their leaders would ever be held responsible. But another set of questions, and this comes from Victor and sort of the follow-on questions to that, an important aspect that could be interesting to discuss is the tension between human rights and environmental protection. For instance, what does a judge do when dealing with environmental cases involving individual fishers violating environmental protection laws to meet their basic subsistence needs? So how do we balance environmental protection and other human rights when they seem to be not sort of moving in the same direction, but at odds? And following from that, how should we decide which environmentally harmful activities should be identified as crimes, and are criminal mechanisms always an effective means for addressing the harm to the environment? And then one last piece of that about the EU, which recently adopted legislation concerning human rights violations in the supply chain, and asking our panelists whether you think this could help reduce environmental crimes to a certain extent. So if we could just sort of tackle those, like what are the crimes, what should be the crimes, and how do we balance the interest in in criminalizing for the purpose of environmental protection against human rights. And just a warning, we may go a few minutes over time, so because there's more to discuss than we have time for. So thanks. I'll leave that to either Amanda or Aphrodite.
Yeah. Thank you, Irene. Sorry, somebody wanted to. I was looking also at the questions in the chat, and I think there are some very interesting reflections that we see here. Let me speak a little bit about the tension between human rights and the environment. I think that now we are going through an era where we see environmental protection and human rights in a more holistic way. In the past, we could see when we had legislation for the protection of the environment, we very often neglected human rights. For instance, when in Uganda or in Rwanda, they created the protected areas for the gorillas, they made like the indigenous and local communities to live, and as a result, these communities, they completely lost touch with the lands where they were living for years, with their culture. And these people now are really live in a very difficult circumstances because they cannot really integrate into the rest of the society. But nowadays, I think we look in this more comprehensive manner. For instance, UNEP during the last year, we had to look at wet markets in several countries in Asia, and wet markets have been regarded as the source of the pandemic. So instead of saying we abolish the wealth markets, we want to see at how can we support this market and the culture and the trade of several people, but without and protect the environment at the same time. So it's not a very clear-cut prohibition, for instance, but we have to see how to balance both the human rights and the livelihoods of the people who depend on certain trade on the one hand and the protection of the environment on the other. Then the first question that you mentioned about, where was it? Can you repeat, Irene? What was the, because that was the second one now I addressed, and I don't know, maybe.
How do we decide which environmentally harmful activities should be identified as crimes? And also whether you think that criminalizing in the supply chain would be helpful.
Yeah, no, I mean,
I think Ananda, yes.
Okay.
So I respond a bit on that. Of course, very, very challenging. And basically, it's also so interesting because, as I was saying, we're looking at environmental law, we're looking at criminal law, trade law, different branches of law. So even if you look inside criminal laws, there's different type of level of offenses, right? And I also want to address the fact that a lot of people had put ecocide actually in the Mentimeter, and I didn't really explain that. And how to understand the relation between environmental crime more broadly and ecocide. So inside criminal law, you have those different levels of crime also. And then criminal law is only an extreme legal response. Of course, in any society, for any type of issues, criminal law should never be the first answer. And it's not a miracle thing to put people in prison. We know that creates another type of very complicated questions. So for any question, you should use a very broad types of sanctions, from administrative sanction to the criminal sanction, and looking at different also intervention beyond just sanctioning people when we talk about looking at alternative livelihood and all of that. So it's really combining a full type of public intervention through the law. And of course, criminal law doesn't intervene in isolation. And also in all of that, the debate about ecocide, I want to just mention that. Ecocide is a term that is being used to make a comparison with genocide, which has been coined by Lemkin after the Second World War, to look at the destruction of a human group in a whole. So it's a type of crime that goes beyond any serious crime in national legislation. That's a crime that shocks the conscience of humanity, and that was established as one of the international crimes with crime against humanity and war crimes. So we're talking about that level of criminal law, a very, very high level. And environmental crimes are at a broader level. They're happening, we've seen with so many examples, they're happening in every country over so many type of species and issues. So that goes much beyond that, and doesn't mean they're not important, but they're at the level of ordinary crime. The same way murder is important, but it's an ordinary crime, and genocide is only at the very, very high level of international crimes. So the debate about ecocide doesn't exist yet, or at least it doesn't exist now in a convention, in an international text. Ecocide is a term in the public debate, in the academic debate, to say sometimes the attack on the environment, it's so intense, it's so widespread, it should be recognized at this level of international crimes. So this is a debate. Maybe in a few years, member states are going to say, we agree with this debate and we want this recognition. That could be in the form of a new crime in the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court that has jurisdiction to look at international crimes. That would be where we could have the very precise legal debate. So that's something very specific. That would be the most serious form of environmental crimes. And then at a lower level, if you go completely at the lower scale of that, you can think of behavior, and basically the solution is what I say when I say criminal law should be used only to target organized crime group. It should not be the solution or not the immediate solution for any type of hunting or any type of harvesting. Here, the law can find other solutions, and it's about being creative with those solutions. Then there was a question about how the judge decide how, when there's a case against someone who's actually an individual doing hunting at a very local scale. Here, there's definitely, once you have the legislation in place, how do you implement this legislation through cases? Here you can also make choices. And it's not much the judge, but more the prosecutors who make the choices about the cases they're going to start or not. What is worth bringing to court and to a criminal judge? And that also where smart decision can be made. And of course, for statistics, sometimes it's easy to go after small fishes and very small cases and small individuals to just win a case, but a small case. And it's much more complicated, but much more important to start those complex cases where many people are involved, where there are transnational elements, and that means you're targeting organized crime. So that's much more complex. And on the legal questions, there's also the question about corporations. And indeed, and especially when we look at illegal logging and illegal fishing, we have to look at corporations. And how do we address that? Well, again, the legal answers are very different from one country to another. And you have countries that recognize the criminal responsibility of legal entities and countries that don't recognize that type of liability, but that can still intervene with other type of sanctions. And it is important. And I think much more can be done, definitely, to go after corporations and to be very clear, to send a clear signal to corporations that kind of use in the functioning costs, know they might have part of their activity that go beyond quota, beyond what they're allowed to do, and they just take it as a negative cost, as a risk they take, going in having an illegal activity. And we've seen that in some cases, especially around fishing. So this is a huge concern. So to stop this mentality, so it's a very specific type of corporation that would really willingly make illegal activities part of their business. So in that sense, you can say the more organized crimes than corporations. The organized crime using a face of corporation, but it's basically organized crime. So you could also say that, and you have to use the tools of organized crime in that sense. And for them, you need to have very strong sanctions because, of course, they are operating with a huge money, and it's important to have sanctions that clearly send a message that this is not right. And it's very different when we talk about local fishing and local communities trying to make a business around species that are becoming overexploited, but those communities need to find alternatives. So those are very different discussions, and in that sense, any answer to an environmental crime issue has to be very nuanced, looking at all the actors and all the type of intervention that are needed and need to coexist on the map of intervention we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think we might go for another maybe 10 minutes just to try to reach some of these other questions. There was another whole set of questions that I sort of think of as raising questions about remedies. So let me just sort of read some of the questions about how we rectify this and how do we think about the kinds of remedies that we want to try to implement. So first, how can we articulate legislative response with viable alternatives for communities and industries to change those behaviors that affect the environment. Because to stop environmental crime, it's not enough to say that's not right, you have to stop or else you'll suffer the consequences, but also to offer alternatives so that they can change the behavior. And furthermore, how can we ensure that legislation on environmental crimes connects with the cosmovision and worldviews that are different from ours, not in an imposing way, but in a constructive way? And I think you've sort of hinted at some of that, but just to ask you maybe to think more specifically about this in terms of the kinds of remedies that we might want. And then a couple of other questions here. Is it better to impose sanctions to corporations and businesses which transit to more eco-friendly actions like lower taxes if they use eco-friendly pesticides, for instance? Or should the businesses which maintain actions that damage the environment be punished? And again, I think you've touched on this, but maybe you just want to think about it specifically in terms of the remedies, and also to hear from Aphrodite about this. And then one other question about military exercises where they explode thousands of kilograms of explosives in the oceans, and how do we remedy those kinds of activities?
Sure. Again, I think all the questions are brilliant, and that shows that we have very engaged participants who already know the topic, and yeah, thank you very much for the great engagement. So to go back, so how do we combine alternative opportunities and livelihood? It's a huge challenge. I mean, it's a real question of society, where it's also not just for one actor to decide. Like those type of questions, you need to put all the stakeholders in the room, and you need to really put together all those different views and to find a way. Also, when we think about alternative livelihood and all of that, it's not for decision maker to decide for the local population what they should be doing instead of poaching. It's really to have this dialogue in a very real way to find solution together. And of course, part of the solution is that local population and indigenous population should benefit from the resources they coexist with. So it shouldn't be something they excluded from. So they shouldn't be excluded from all the economic benefits you can have around, let's say, national parks, so around ecotourism and all of that. So you could make sure that local population are encouraged to become the experts, to become the guards, to become the guides, to become very much the guardians of the parks, and so they benefit also financially from that activity. To find how to also, yeah, to create financial economic incentive around being allies to the conservation. I think it's really important. Just on the question about
I just want to make sure also that Aphrodite can weigh in on this.
Yeah, thank
then
you,
we also
Erin.
have questions about
Yes,
waste.
thanks a lot. Yeah, no, just to recap a little bit, because here there are two groups of stakeholders mentioned, the communities and the industry. For the communities, I think we said a lot about the holistic approach in environmental protection and how we need to look at both protection of the environment and human rights, and how these communities are part of this environment. And as Amanda mentioned, there is a lot to be done with dialogue and really highlighting the role of these people for the environmental protection. Then when it comes to corporations and industry, this is another area. I think one area that creates a lot of difficulties in prosecution is when it comes to jurisdiction, because with multinational corporations, we have the corporate veil. So where they are subjected to jurisdiction can be a tricky affair. And sometimes we see that there is a major case that is rejected on the basis of admissibility before a court for environmental, activities that may fall under crime, environmental crime. But I think that a lot is done under corporate social responsibility, and a lot of big industries and corporations are very interested in developing codes of conduct and are very much interested in ethics and how the consumers see them. So we are going to be seeing more about that.
Great. Thank you. And I also just want to mention another comment that's just come in, asking about sort of balancing the local versus state power, and that so often we try to remedy these issues at the local level because that's where the environmental damage is most felt, and yet criminalization as a response tends to shift power to the state. Let me just ask you a few questions about waste in particular. And about e-waste and the exporting of waste to developing countries from developed countries, and how do we hold leaders and other actors responsible for that? And also specifically a question about how is UNEP planning to tackle the waste trafficking via unwaste? I imagine it's rather hard to interfere with the policies of states in this respect. And then another specific question about construction and demolition waste. So I would ask you to just comment briefly on that if you have a moment.
Yeah, if I may, very briefly, I saw these questions and I also put some answers just to help in case the people who put the questions didn't have the time to discuss this. For the e-waste, there's a lot going on under the Basel Convention. There's also guidance, I think, under development, and I put the link in the chat for those interested, because this is, of course, a major concern how electronic waste from developed countries is dumped to developing countries. Then on the unwaste, it will be a 3.5-4 year project. So there is a legal component, but at the beginning there will be a lot done on the ground in cooperation with the countries to understand the waste flows between Europe and Southeast Asia, with a focus on the COVID-19 waste. So of course, whatever we recommend to countries also depend on the cooperation we have with the countries. And we may make a recommendation for legislative action, but then it always depends on the countries on whether they will go ahead with this recommended action or not.
Great, thank you. I'm afraid there's so much more to talk about, but I'm afraid we are out of time. So I just want to, on behalf of the GNHRE and UNEP and our audience, I just want to thank you for these incredibly rich and thought-provoking presentations, and thank you to our participants for these very fantastic questions. Please join us for our sessions tomorrow on environmental rule of law, which Aphrodite mentioned in UNEP's first global report on that, and also on decolonization and protected areas. In addition to those two programs, we're also hosting a Works in Progress seminar moderated by the UN Special Rapporteur, David Boyd. The full schedule, of course, is on the website at gnhre.org. Look for the Summer Winter School. We look forward to seeing you throughout the week, and we thank you very, very much for participating in this session today. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.